50 million years before the first dinosaurs walked the earth, in the shallow coastal swamps of what would one day become Illinois, a strange creature slid silently through the murky water. The world was the Carboniferous, a time when vast coal forests stretched across continents, giant dragonflies ruled the air, and amphibians began to crawl onto land. But hidden in the dark lagoons of Mazon Creek, a mystery was taking shape, a creature so bizarre that when its fossils were first discovered, no one could decide what it was. Its body was soft, slender, and unarmored, no longer than the span of a human forearm. 2 eyes protruded from the sides of its head on stiff stalks, like periscopes surveying the dim world. From its front extended a long, narrow proboscis ending in a toothed claw, a mouthpiece that looked more like an alien tool than an organ of flesh. This was Tullimonstrum, the Tully Monster. It swam with undulating ripples of its body, guided by a vertical tail fin shaped like a paddle. Unlike fish, its motion seemed serpentine, weaving side to side in the green-brown haze. It was neither fully like an arthropod nor like a vertebrate, neither worm nor fish, but something in between, a puzzle piece that seemed to belong to no puzzle. When it hunted, its proboscis darted forward, the claws snapping shut around small prey. Worms, soft-bodied invertebrates, perhaps even larvae drifting in the water. The catch was dragged swiftly back to the mouth, hidden behind the stalked eyes. Each strike was quick, deliberate, as though the creature lived in constant hunger. Yet the Tully Monster itself was prey as well. In those same waters swam sharks and giant fish, armored and swift. The soft, boneless body of Tullimonstrum offered little defense. Its survival depended on stealth, on slipping through vegetation and shadow, on never staying in the open too long. Millions of years later, when its fossils would be uncovered in nodules of ironstone, paleontologists would argue over its identity. Was it a worm, a mollusk, a relative of lampreys? Each new discovery only deepened the debate. But in its own time, the Tully Monster needed no classification. It lived, hunted, and survived in the Carboniferous swamps, a strange and fleeting design in life's endless experiment. The waters of Mazon Creek were thick with life, though much of it fragile, soft-bodied, and rarely preserved. Worms wriggled in the mud, tiny crustaceans scuttled through silt, and jelly-like creatures drifted with the currents. Tully monsters moved among them like shadows, weaving with side-to-side ripples, their vertical tail fins catching faint beams of sunlight that filtered through the swampy surface. Their eyes, perched far apart on rigid stalks, gave them a wide field of view. A flicker above, a disturbance in the silt below. Nothing escaped their gaze. Predators were always near, sleek sharks circling the shallows, and primitive fish with armor-plated heads patrolling the depths. To survive, the Tully Monster relied on vigilance, a constant scanning of its world through 5, 10, 20 different angles at once. Its proboscis, thin and flexible, curved with deceptive gentleness before snapping shut with a toothed claw. Worms pulled from burrows, larvae plucked from drifting clusters, even soft-bodied fish fry. It seized them all, dragging them back beneath its eyes to the mouth hidden in its soft body. There was nothing elegant about its feeding, but there was efficiency. Every strike was energy in a world that offered little mercy. At times, schools of small fish darted past, silver flashes weaving through the water. The Tully Monster could not match their speed. Instead, it lingered at the edge of vegetation, striking only at stragglers, at the slow or the unwary. Its body was not built for chases but for ambush. The swamp itself was a place of contrasts. Towering trees with scaly bark rose from soggy ground above, their roots tangling into the water. Ferns spread wide fronds, casting shadows that turned the shallows into green twilight. Fallen branches rotted into muck, feeding colonies of fungi and insects. This world was ancient, alien, and yet familiar, the first echoes of forests we know today. Beneath those trees, amphibians crawled, their slick bodies shining in the wet air. Some were no larger than a hand, others stretched to lengths of several meters. Their calls echoed at the water's edge, blending with the hum of dragonflies whose wings spanned nearly a foot. The Tully Monster swam below all this, unseen, unknown, but part of the same symphony of life. In the murkier depths, larger dangers prowled. Primitive sharks, their bodies more rigid than their modern kin, cut through the haze with relentless hunger. Their teeth were serrated, their senses tuned to the faintest vibration. For the Tully Monster, one mistake meant being swallowed whole. And yet, the Tully endured. Its soft body could bend and twist, slipping into narrow crevices where no shark could follow. Its tail fin acted like a rudder, pivoting sharply as it darted into shadow. It could not outfight its hunters, but it could outmaneuver them in the labyrinth of swamp and root. Fossils tell us that Tullimonstrum lived in vast numbers. They were not solitary anomalies, but thriving creatures, perhaps gathering in loose groups, feeding in the same patches of water. Imagine a cluster of them, dozens rippling in silent synchronization, their eyes swiveling in unison, their proboscises curling and striking in a strange ballet of feeding. Still, survival was never guaranteed. For every meal captured, there was a near escape. For every shadow evaded, another loomed. The Tully Monster's very form spoke of compromise, too soft to dominate, too strange to vanish. It existed in the margins, where life often finds a way. Some scientists speculate that its eyes, mounted on rigid bars, may have been more advanced than they appear, capable of distinguishing light and shadow with unusual clarity. If so, its survival was not only due to agility, but to awareness, a vigilance unmatched by most creatures of its size. The proboscis, meanwhile, remains a riddle. Was it simply a feeding tool, or could it probe mud and silt for hidden prey? Fossils preserve it as a curved, delicate organ, yet tipped with a claw so alien it seems mechanical. In life, it must have flicked and darted like a whip, a weapon as strange as it was effective. As twilight fell across the Carboniferous swamps, the water grew still, broken only by drifting pollen and the faint shimmer of insects falling from leaves above. In this dimness, the Tully Monsters prowled, their silhouettes gliding like ghosts, their stalked eyes glinting faint reflections of the fading sun. At night, the swamp belonged to other hunters, amphibians croaking from the shallows, insects drumming wings in the humid air, and unseen predators stirring in the water. But the Tully Monster did not rest. It moved continuously, quietly, a restless scavenger feeding on whatever it could find. Storms were the great equalizers. When rain lashed the swamp and rivers flooded into lagoons, the water turned turbulent, carrying branches, mud, and creatures alike in chaotic torrents. For the Tully Monster, such storms brought danger, but also opportunity. Disoriented prey was swept into its path, easy to seize. For every predator that hunted it, the chaos of storms blurred the balance. Fossil beds in Mazon Creek suggest that many Tully Monsters were trapped in sudden burial events, floods that carried silt and sediment, entombing entire communities. Perhaps they swam in shallow bays as the tide turned, only to be caught in a surge of mud. Their bodies, too soft to endure otherwise, were sealed in stone, preserving their strangeness for hundreds of millions of years. When humans finally uncovered them, their laughter echoed the same disbelief as the first scientists who tried to piece the fossils together. What could it be? A worm? A mollusk? A primitive fish? The Tully Monster defied classification. To this day, its true identity remains uncertain, perched at the edge of vertebrate and invertebrate, a ghost of an evolutionary experiment, lost in time. And yet, in that uncertainty lies its power. The Tully Monster reminds us that life's story is not a straight line, but a web of possibilities, many of them ending in strange, forgotten branches. To know it is to glimpse how weird, how wild, how creative evolution can be. Its soft body is gone, its proboscis no longer curls, its stalked eyes no longer scan the swamp, but in stone, its shape endures, and in memory, it still swims, the monster of Mazon Creek, strange, fragile, eternal. 50 million years before the first dinosaurs, the swamps of what would one day become Illinois breathed like a sleeping animal. Roots knotted the brown water. Fronds like green hands filtered the light into ribbons, and dragonflies with wings broader than a human palm stitched silver seams through the haze. Beneath that trembling surface, where the sunlight broke into motes and the mud remembered storms, a slender shadow moved. It moved not like a fish, but like a conjecture, an idea of a body thinking itself through water. A ripple traveled down its flank, and the vertical fin at its tail tilted like a blade, correcting the drift. The eyes were set far apart, mounted on a rigid bar like lanterns at the ends of a yoke, each eye staring down separate corridors of dimness. Between and below those eyes, a narrow proboscis uncurled, hesitated, and then curled again, as if practicing speech in a language no creature had yet learned. Tullimonstrum, the Tully Monster. In its own time, it had no name at all, only a radius of hunger and a perimeter of dread. It was no longer than a forearm, a length of compliant muscle without armor or spines, a soft lyric in a world that spoke in plates and teeth. It did not own the swamp. It read the swamp, scanned it, parsed it. The swamp was grammar, and the Tully Monster was a sentence that could end badly at any moment. A tremor shivered the mud. Tiny feet worked like type bars, kicking silt into punctuation. Worms braided themselves through the loosened sediment. The eyes at the ends of the bar rolled a fraction, almost nothing, and the proboscis descended with a patient certainty. At its tip, a beaklet, two opposed elements, not teeth, but acting like teeth, opened and closed in a whisper that only the picked could hear. Silt lifted, a pale thread writhed, then vanished into the hidden mouth beneath the head. The body flexed, registered the small heat of the catch, and became still again. Far above, a different sentence formed, a shark's silhouette, more rigid than its descendants would one day be, triangulated a path through the green. In the shadow of its passage, amphibia held their breath in roots, and small fish packed their bodies tightly into the geometry of a school as if safety were an equation. The Tully Monster flattened its intent, floated, where stems scribbled on the water the way wind scribbles on grass. The shark drifted over. The silence remained unbroken, for the shark's silence is its instrument, and silence is what it had brought. The swamp breathed. It exhaled tannin and old rain. It kept its secrets. Toward late light, the lagoon warmed enough that bubbles rose in lazy chains from rotting wood. On certain afternoons, pollen fell in drifts that looked like weather turned inside out, a snowfall the color of dust. In that suspended dusk, the Tully Monster fed as if writing a list no one else would read. Grains of plankton, the translucent curl of larval legs. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then a pause, the proboscis poised above a burrow mound like a question mark addressing the ground. When the mound twitched, the answer came quick and unkind. It had no bones as we count bones. It had no armor that could be polished by fear into courage. It had a method. The eyes read, the tail edited, the proboscis signed. But methods can be broken by weather. A storm shouldered down from the inland forests as evening grew heavy. Wind unstitched the dragonflies' seams. Reeds lay their faces to the surface as if in prayer. Pressure fell, and with it the water rose, pushing lakes into creeks and creeks into brown scrolls that wrote new banks where no banks had been. In the first rush of it, the Tully Monster tumbled, its body flipping in a tight roll, the vertical fins slapping a new angle as sand scattered like photons. Branches, seeds, the unnecessary answers of dead leaves, everything moved. Some things moved for the last time. The storm was a wheel, and the swamp a groove. The wheel turned. The body drifted until it found a slack behind a fallen trunk. The calm the flood leaves behind for those quick enough to claim it. There the eyes steadied to their starboard and port surveillances. There the proboscis uncoiled and sampled the shadow. And there, in silt rearranged by a river's mindless reason. Food came as if payment were due. On the bank, the low calls of amphibians stitched the air into a net that caught nothing. In the air, wings beat. In the water, pulses traveled. The Tully Monster fed, and in feeding it learned, for in this swamp every mouthful is a tutorial on what the swamp can do to you if you forget what it is. Night owned the color from the surface down, but the water kept a little of day to itself. In that marine dusk, the Tully Monster used the margin between two kinds of dark. Its eyes did not shine. They gathered. They did not cast. They received. When a school of fry veered wrong and broke apart, it did not pursue. It waited, a trick of patience that looks like intelligence and may be enough of it to matter. When the slowest of the stray came within the range of the proboscis made its quiet absolutes. There were other hunters, and other ways to be a monster. Armor-shouldered fish held to the deeper runs where the water cut clean and cold. Crustaceans with shields clung to submerged bark, fanning the world toward their mouths. In the shallows, the small struck at the smaller, and under the silt the worms wrote the first drafts of fear. What the Tully Monster knew by body, not by mind, was that every edge cut both ways. In the broad water, there was room to escape and room to be seen. In the weed, there was cover, and there were things that owned the weed the way a name owns a story. Day returned like an apology. Sunlight turned the surface back into a mirror, polished by dragonflies. Shadows of tall plants fell to the bottom and broke into the puzzle pieces that are light when it spends itself on water. The Tully Monster slid through the puzzle and made no sound. It did not prefer the light. It preferred the edges of the light, where brightness becomes data and dimness becomes plan. By midday, the swamp was warm enough that gas gathered in the chests of fallen logs and released itself with soft syllables. Above, the leaves made negatives of themselves in their own shadows. On a branch that reached out over water like a hand, a primitive amphibian rested, its skin like wet leather, its eyes the deliberate currency of things that watch more than they move. Below, the Tully Monster crossed the language of its shadow. The amphibian shifted. Neither spoke to the other. They were in different sentences entirely, but the page was the same. Hunger is a scale. On one end, the certainty of strength. On the other, the cache of being missed. The Tully Monster had never set a foot on land, and never would. Its nostalgia, if it had any, was for the next calm pocket of water. It occupied a grammar of margins. Where to be soft is to be in debt to speed, and to be slow is to be in debt to mind. It had speed enough to vanish, and mind enough to accept vanishing as a plan. Afternoon returned the water to its gentle argument. This is where it wanted to be. The debate along the bank where the current loses confidence and ideas have time to quiet down. Snails drew silver threads on the underside of leaves that dipped and rose. The proboscis touched the thread and found nothing there to matter. It turned to a small vortex on the bottom where a burrowing creature's door breathed. The claw opened with the restraint of tools and closed with the hush of a verdict. Silt rose, fell, and was back to what it had been 5 minutes before, except for the absence that remained. Far downslope, the flood's old anger had laid a raft of leaves into a corner that had no business being a corner, only a chance in the geometry of water and wood. In that damp, things changed. Bacteria made treaties with rot. The treaties paid in bubbles. The bubbles rose, and the Tully Monster moved. It had measured this calculus before. Where bubbles are, the eating may be. Where eating is, danger is never wrong. The eyes watched 2 ways, while the mouth did the third. In the green of the day, a shadow like a blade cut in from the deeper run. The world did what the world does when a shark arrives. It narrowed. The Tully Monster abandoned the raft of leaves without confessing it was leaving. It simply was not there anymore. It aligned itself along a line of stems and waited, aware of how roots make room for bodies that learn to be root for a while, and then water when harm is past. The shark turned where the water turned. Its body cast no doubt on its fitness for the work it wanted. It did not linger in the weed, because lingering is what you do when you have time, and the shark was always on the verge of something. It sampled the weed with the turn of a fin and the cock of an eye, and then it moved on, reading the big text again, where the page is wide and the letters have space. When it was gone, the Tully Monster reassembled itself, as if it had been many pieces arranged as a diagram, and now the diagram could be a single phrase again. It returned to the raft and found other small lives had braved it in the pressure of its absence. Food, but never the kind that makes you brave. The proboscis performed the small economies for which it had been made. If a life can be understood as a sentence, then the swamp wrote run-ons. Clauses braided into clauses until meaning became a current, and the current whatever it wanted. The Tully Monster did not mind run-ons. It placed itself in commas. It hid in parentheses. When danger tried to make an exclamation point of the day, it turned itself into the ellipsis that means, not yet. Evening returned the dragonflies to their dark shelves. The air learned the temperature of water and offered to trade. The trade was good for both. On the bank, a chorus of amphibians took up work on a song with only 2 notes, and still all the feeling. The Tully Monster cruised beneath the project as if it were the ceiling of its house. The light lost an argument with depth, and went to look for other rooms. In the limit between where the eye holds and where the guess begins, a storm gathers, even when no clouds can be seen. It was the kind of tide pulse that comes when rivers remember mountains. No one here had seen the mountains, but the mountains speak in the language called flood, and the flood says, now. The Tully Monster felt the first shove and tilted to take it in profile, like a body that knows which shoulder should meet a door. It let itself ride with just enough tail to avoid the math of branches. Around it, the world went slantwise. It learned again the routes that water chooses when no one is steering but gravity's patient hand. When the push relented, the bottom had changed. New sand wrote itself over old sand. New channels pretended to be old channels. The Tully Monster read the page anew. Many creatures failed to read as quickly. A small fish, stunned, turned on the wrong axis and presented its side where a stealth animal could not help but see. The proboscis found it, and the quiet mouth did what quiet mouths are for. Hunger eased, caution never. The eyes kept their dual accounting, credits and debits of shadow and glare. In the day that followed, the world smelled like the storm had left behind more of itself than rain. Fruit hung low over backwater that had not been backwater yesterday. Insects mended themselves with work and sang mending songs. On the bottom, caches of the storm littered the shelf like the toys of a careless child. Seeds, shells, cut stems with the sap still telling stories. The Tully Monster moved through the stories at reading speed, pausing to turn a page that might have a small meat pressed into it. A cluster of others came like punctuation marks in the same paragraph. 3, then 5, then a dozen, each body describing the same grammar in a slightly different handwriting. They did not hunt together. They hunted near. Their eyes scanned to their own schedules. Their proboscises registered private claims. Yet in the group there was a safety of probabilities. A shark will choose the fish alone in the wide water. The Tully Monsters wrote themselves into proximity, and thus out of a certain fate. A shadow approached that was not shark. An armor-headed fish nosed the weed, slow as a thought that takes the long road to judgment. Its plates said, not worth the trouble. The Tully Monsters adjusted their paragraphs to avoid the footnotes no one wants to read. The day grew into itself without losing anybody to the margin. So the swamp made days, and the days made bodies, and the bodies made more days by the work of eating and not being eaten in the same turning. The Tully Monster had no doctrine but this. In a year of many storms it found 2 quiet months and grew by the measure that quiet allows. In a year of less weather it wandered broader, counting shallow bays as if they were beads on a line. It found one such bay in a late season when the air trembled with the heat of rotting leaves. The bay was eye-shaped and calm at the iris. Fish fry pricked its surface in a code of hunger and fear. In the bay's deeper lid, silt lay smooth as a made-bed. The Tully Monster entered as if entering sleep, except its eyes never closed. It tested the middle with a long curve of body and learned the walls with its tail. It chose a route that balanced escape with comfort and settled to its low work. Storms do not ask if you are finished. When the flood took the bay, it took it like a hand closing. Water spoke the fierce syllables of gravity. A log rolled like a sentence gone wrong. Silt rose like smoke. In that churn, a leaf raft collapsed, flipped a fish, pinned a small life whose name is only its meal value. The Tully Monster rode the violence to a pocket behind a stub of root, and there it breathed the storm in small sips and watched for what the storm would deliver. What it delivered, this time, were more Tully Monsters. The pocket filled with bodies that wrote the same script against one another, one eyebar beside another eyebar, proboscises speaking quietly into the water like pen nibs. When the storm passed, the pocket remained, crowded now with those who had chosen that answer. They spread again. They left in threes. The pocket remembered them with stray air bubbles and a newly polished stone. By then, the year had grown old enough to say so. Days shortened. Light sloped in with a copper advice. The Tully Monster learned that the shallow banks warmed faster but cooled faster, and chose the deep runs in mornings. It kept close to slopes where roots tie water down. It passed under a mat of vegetation that had set its seeds loose like small boats, and the boats bumped its eyebar and showed the bar how to feel even when seeing was less sure. Hunger does not vanish in cold. It becomes a book with smaller type. The Tully Monster read the small type, the larvae that came late to their finish, the worms that worked slower and so cast longer shadows in their slight movements, the bits the storms had not erased but only misplaced. In this tiny print, a life can be continued paragraph by paragraph as long as the patience of reading holds. The swamp kept its largest secret in the iron of its mud. What would become of this body when the body became past tense? Up on the banks, nodules formed, the way a thought forms around a worry, the concretion that says, "Keep this." When flood and luck and silt conspired in the right ratios, a Tully Monster died into a pocket that sealed itself like a letter, and the swamp set about remembering in a mineral grammar what the water had once written in muscle. But not today. Today the Tully Monster lived in the tense, called now. It moved to the rhythm it knew. It was neither fish nor worm nor anything that would fit cleanly into a future taxonomy. It was the sentence the swamp invented to say, "Try this," and so it tried. Another burrow, another curve of tail, another strategy of seeing while not being seen. It stitched itself through the day, a soft thread passing the eye of the swamp's needle, mending and being mended, a thin persistence in a fabric much older than its own weave. Dawn lifted a thin layer of mist from the water and left it hanging among the knees of roots. The Tully Monster worked the contour where shade surrendered to green light, taking the edge the way a reader takes a margin with a finger before turning the page. A ribbon of larvae drifted like punctuation, loosened from a sentence. The proboscis reached, pinched, pulled. The mouth made quiet work of small things that did not know they had been chosen. Farther out, the surface puckered where a school rehearsed its angles. The Tully Monster did not join the rehearsal. It waited in the claws it knew, be available, remain invisible. Across the lagoon, something larger practiced certainty. A shark angled out of the deeper run and let its body settle into the heavy glide that means appetite. Sand lifted where its tail scissored. The small read the message and tightened into shapes that looked like safety because safety often looks like a crowd. The Tully Monster read a different message, the weeds' hip-high alleys, the tunnels under mats of fallen fronds, the way a vertical tail, set just so, lets a body hinge around its own center without revealing itself. It shifted into the alley and held, an ellipsis behind stems. The shark tested the margin with a single tilt and a small flex that sent a wave along its flank like a rumor. The alley did not answer. Rumors need listeners. Stems are poor gossips. The shark turned back to the open text and wrote its signature there, a dark line over green script. When it passed, the Tully Monster unwound a fraction, the way a hand relaxes around a tool after the weight has been measured and accepted. The day thickened. Sun ran into the water and broke into slow coins on the sand. From the bank, a fallen branch reached into the lagoon like the sentence of a tree that had changed tense. Its bark sloughed in drifting ribbons. Under that mild collapse, crustaceans combed the world toward themselves. The Tully Monster approached at an angle, not committed, testing for signals of ownership. The eye-bar kept opposite watch, one globe monitoring the branch's underside, the other measuring the open behind. The proboscis touched the bark as if it could smell through its tip, learned that the best things here were other mouths feeding, and waited for one to relax its grip. When a small shrimp-like form eased its fan to reset, the beaklet closed. The branch gave up a whisper of silt. The world continued. Evening came with the light slant that makes edges matter. The Tully Monster followed the slant to a cove where the bank's curve held a thin raft of floating seeds. They made a faint, constant tapping against the eye-bar, a drum so soft it was more information than alarm. Beneath the raft, the slow water kept a mirror no one could see unless they became it. The Tully Monster learned the mirror by touch, trimmed its course with the tail fin and fed again. Careful, because careful is a kind of hunger too. That night the swamp rehearsed a different play. A warm wind ran low, heavy with the musk of leaf rot and the iron breath of mud. Fireflies wrote small equations in the air above black water. Their math did not reach below, except as flickers stitched into the surface that told the Tully Monster where the ceiling was if it looked up. It looked up enough to know, down enough to live. In the dark, it pushed by memory along a route the tail remembered, even when eyes were only receiving grain and shadow. It found the seep where cooler water bled from the bank, and lingered at the seam where two temperatures dispute possession of a yard of lagoon. Things collect at seams, so do chances. From the seam, a vibration came without shadow, a texture in water that bodies learn like weather. Not shark, not fish. A long-bodied amphibian, half committed to land, slid from root to water with the gulp of something trying on a different medium. It pushed toward the seam, jaw opening in the slow confidence of an animal that eats by surprise and inertia. The Tully Monster gave it neither, a discreet pivot on the vertical tail, a slip behind a leaf's dark hull, a pause that taught the amphibian nothing and rewarded the Tully Monster with breath and calm. When morning returned, the lagoon had moved half an inch to the left, the way all places move when no one is measuring with instruments finer than memory. The Tully Monster found a shelf of clean sand laid down by the night's small politics of current. Burrows pricked the surface like punctuation. The proboscis wrote replies. Here, a quick pinch and withdraw. There, a deeper press that invited something to answer, and then punished the answer. Not all presses paid. Once the sand burst with a jaw-ringed worm, teeth like a trapdoor's hinges. The Tully Monster felt the graze, jerked in a tight S that bent the eye-bar and set both eyes to one side for a heartbeat, then uncoiled and left the worm with nothing but silt to close on. The mark the teeth left faded in minutes. The memory did not. Heat rose in the day until bubbles rehearsed a constant exhale from logs and buried leaves. The Tully Monster surfed the fizzing shade like a commuter who knows the train's rhythm by the hum in the rail. Above, a dragonfly hung on a stem, its wings iridescent equations no one here would solve. It clacked its jaws around something soft and secret. The sound did not travel under. Sounds do not cross that membrane the same way fear does. Fear flows both ways. The swamp is full of pipes for it. Midday sharpened the contrast enough to make hunting into geometry. The Tully Monster used the angles. It placed the eye-bar so that one pupil watched the cast shadow of a twig, while the other watched the bright flare where a burrow breathed out a filament of silt. The proboscis leaned into the flare and found flesh. It leaned into a second and found only the signature of breath. 2 meals out of 3 is luxury. It took the luxury and did not advertise. A surge rolled through the lagoon from nowhere anyone could see. Pressure does that sometimes when the river upstream decides to think with rain again. The surge lifted rafts, tipped leaves, scrolled a page, and left it unnumbered. With the surge came bodies from the channel. Stunned fry, a beetle rowing in the wrong dimension, a soft thing coil-striped and unfamiliar. The Tully Monster took what it could in the second before shadow fell over everything like a verdict. The shark again. The lagoon tightened. What the Tully Monster did then was not courage. It was knowledge. It pivoted into the shallowest sliver at the bank, set its body parallel to the slope, and flattened its ripples so the tail became a sketched line rather than a flag. The shark swept the sliver with a fin tip, tasting the plan, and chose not to spend energy on a hypothesis that promised weeds and disappointment. It moved on. The sliver widened into water again. The Tully Monster loosened, reassembled, found its breath, and ate the last of the stunned beetle, because that is how small victories end, with the practical work of finishing. There were days of weather and days of waiting, days when the lagoon was a page too smudged to read, and days when it was set in a typeface so clear even the smallest letters insisted on being understood. The Tully Monster lived both kinds. It learned that the bank's overhang gave safety and cut light. It learned that the center glittered with hazard and sometimes reward. It learned that groups of its own provide neither love nor law but a change in the math predators do, and math can be a shelter. Once in the late slant, a dozen Tully Monsters drifted into the same U-shaped hollow carved by a high-water tantrum. They arranged themselves as if language had asked them to form a paragraph. Each watched some part of what the others did not. Each proboscis made its solo decisions. When a shark tested the mouth of the U, it faced many lines of silence instead of one. It moved away, performing its confidence elsewhere. The paragraph broke into sentences again, each swimming off with its private subject and verb. Cold slid down from the inland trees as the season darkened. Not winter. This world knew different cycles than those that would come later, but a moderation that asked for thrift. The Tully Monster answered by shortening its routes. It held to deeper grooves at noon and rose to the shelves when light had warmed them a little. It fed more on buried things, fewer on the bright mistakes near the surface. The proboscis learned to read faint ridges in the sand the way a fingertip reads a blind letter. The eyebar learned that in dimness the important motion is not large, but honest. On a day when the water had the smell of iron pushed toward the nose by chill, thunder stumbled somewhere far off. The first drops were wide and few, coins scattered on a table to see how they sound. Then the table tipped. Rain hammered the lagoon flat, then stippled, then a blurred sheet as if the sky had decided to descend and try being water for a while. In that decision, everything moved again. Leaves rafted. Roots wrote new cursive. The Tully Monster rolled, corrected, slid into a culvert along the bank where the flow narrowed into a thread strong enough to hold two. There it faced upstream and let the current do the work of bringing the world past its mouth. In flood, choices collapse. You eat what arrives, or you starve with standards. A pale worm came like a length of sentence torn loose. The beaklet closed. A larva spun in panic's small circle. The proboscis trapped its circle into a line. A ribbon of silt flew up and turned the world into a curtain. The Tully Monster waited instead of guessing, the way patience is sometimes a muscle. When the flood laid down its argument, the lagoon had become a room with new furniture. Sand draped a fallen branch like a blanket. An old pool where food had been was now a hump where nothing would be until someone tunneled it useful again. At the bank, a low ledge of mud had accreted into a lip that would, in time, bake, crack, and break into nodules. Those closed letters the swamp sends to the future. None of that mattered to the Tully monster this hour. It mattered to the fossil it would someday be. The living animal took inventory. Oxygen here, cover there, roots over and under, a seam of colder water where it could cool a body gone hot with work. Predators adapted by moving. A heavily plated fish patrolled a new gutter and found it to its liking, turning again and again along its armored certainty. The Tully monster learned the gutter's limits and set its own limits just outside them. A long-bodied amphibian took to a shelf with puddle depth where small things gathered. The Tully monster avoided the shelf and the farce of chasing what another hunter had already named. It did not contest. It edited. There were still calm afternoons. On one such day, light came through in clean bars. The lagoon held its breath and released it evenly. The Tully monster swam a slow figure, not hunting, just updating its map. Under a thin raft of seeds, a small fish dozed or tried to. The proboscis drifted near, not touching, then touched lightly to learn if stillness meant sleep or readiness. Readiness, a flick and gone. The Tully monster did not waste energy. A moment later, a different stillness proved to be a worm between choices. The beaklet made the decision for it. In the distance, the river said something low and continuous about the moon. Tides in this place were not the master they would become elsewhere, but the moon's grammar can be felt in any water that listens. The lagoon listened. Its edges grew more persuasive, and then relaxed. In those crescents of change, the Tully monster found a rhythm that granted it 2 sure meals and 3 safe hours, a bargain better than most bargains in this age. Night again. The swamp cooled enough that mist rebuilt its architecture between stems. On the bank, amphibians set their throats to work. In the air, a dragonfly made its last patrol into a web and translated itself from flight into food. The Tully monster slid under the scene, immune to webs but not to the idea of entanglement. Its entanglements were in silt and weed, in the way roots can trap a body that panics. It did not panic. It practiced the slow retreat, the small advance, the stillness that waits for the world to choose a direction and then travels behind it. There are nights when a body knows it should not be where it is. The Tully monster felt such a night in the shift of the water's skin, and the taste that came through its mouth like a coin of metal. Upstream, ironstone stirred. Downstream, mud thickened. Somewhere, something had collapsed enough to change the sentences the river would write. The lagoon seemed calm, but underneath, plans were moving toward an event called burial, though no one here had a word for it. The Tully monster hunted lightly, as if sound could be made by hunger. It tucked into a fold behind a root and let the fold hold it. Hours later, a slow wave of silt arrived. Not a wall, not a crush, a settling. Things became heavier than they had been. Fins required more insistence to carve their way. The root's fold became a pocket. The pocket became a glove. Bodies that had not prepared filled with the river's new substance and gave up their maps. The Tully monster pressed its flank against the root, angled the tail to keep the mouth clear, and breathed the soup. Silt wrote itself into every crease of the scene. The pocket narrowed and then paused. Rivers are patient, but not always thorough. A window remained. The Tully monster found it and went through. When morning came, the lagoon was not the lagoon of yesterday. It was a draft of a future rock. Flat, laid silt, new shelves, hummocks that would turn to nodules if the sun let them. In one quiet low, a shape lay that would never move again, its soft plan sealed, its eyebar quiet, proboscis curved as if in mid-thought. The Tully monster passed over without knowing it passed over itself in another telling. It had lived. It kept living. That is how stories get to be long enough to matter. By the time the sun reached its hard angle, hunger returned to ordinary size. The Tully monster counted shelves, counted shadows, counted the lazy rise of gas from beneath bark. It fed where the math said yes, It refused where the math said debt. It kept the map current. It kept the tail honest. It kept the eyes busy and the proboscis precise. The swamp kept its lessons coming, the way swamps do when they have all the time, and you do not. By late light, the water turned copper again. Dragonflies lowered their patrols and found stems. Amphibians tested songs and decided they were worth singing. The Tully Monster took one last pass along the bank, checked the slivers of safety, and settled where root and water made a seam. Above, leaves moved like slow green fire. Below, sand held the day's footprints in silt so fine even the idea of a print was a kindness. Breath slowed. The eyebar drifted, still watchful, because watchfulness is how soft bodies buy sleep. The night did not promise anything. It rarely does, but the body believed in morning because morning had occurred so many times already that to doubt it would not change the math. The Tully Monster rested, and the swamp, which never rests, turned its dark machinery another notch toward whatever next would be. The morning that followed began without spectacle, just a slow brightening, a pale wash through mist, a chorus of small voices, no larger than the hunger that produced them. The Tully Monster rose from its root-seam refuge, the vertical tail flexing once, twice, before settling into the rhythm of movement. The lagoon was quieter than usual, but quiet is often the loudest signal. Leaves floated where they had not floated yesterday. A new shelf of silt leaned out into the water like a sentence added to a story already difficult to follow. The Tully Monster read it with the eyes on its bar, one tracing the shelf's shadow, the other checking the shallows behind. Nothing moved, and so the proboscis tested, curling into the lip of sand. A worm answered. The worm ended. Beyond the shelf, trilobites gathered in a pattern less like a march and more like a council. Their shells clinked as they crossed one another, an accidental percussion that gave the day a beat. The Tully Monster did not join, did not contest. It remained on the margins, circling, proboscis curling in small rehearsals. The trilobite's confidence was a wall. Walls are not climbed by ribbon bodies. They are weighted out. Hunger, however, does not wait well, so the Tully Monster drifted farther, toward the narrow inlet where current pushed hard enough to write new lines in sand. There it found an alley of debris, stems, shells. A dragonfly husk collapsed into the likeness of parchment. Small amphipods worked the pile with the industry of scribes. The proboscis reached into their script, plucked a word, swallowed it, and let the rest continue writing. Above, clouds gathered into darker clauses. Thunder rehearsed its consonants. Rain returned, first in commas, then in paragraphs. The lagoon blurred under the manuscript of the storm, every surface rewritten at once. Large predators withdrew to the channels where strength has room. The Tully Monster stayed in the margins, pressed into the interlinear spaces between root and sand. There it learned a truth of soft bodies. Storms erase, but also refill. What is lost in clarity is gained in food. When the water calmed again, the lagoon was thick with plankton. A galaxy spilled across a black page. The Tully Monster moved through it with the patience of a reader, tracing letters in darkness. Strike, swallow, strike, swallow. Each meal a syllable, each syllable a survival. Farther out, shadows rehearsed menace. The shark again, looping its line like a signature it wanted the lagoon to memorize. The Tully Monster did not offer itself as a witness. Instead, it tucked into a hollow eyebar, angled just enough to record the performance without being cast in it. When the shark left, the hollow held its silence. Evening bent light into copper again. The swamp behind sang in tones that might have been mourning, or might have been joy. The Tully Monster fed once more from a seam where worms breathed out faint trails of silt. Then it retreated to the root's crease, the one it trusted, the one that had always been there. Breath slowed. The eyes remained open. For another day the story held. The Tully Monster endured, not as a ruler, not as a terror, but as a survivor, writing its line in the margins of time. Mist woke before the light, a thin skin drawn over the lagoon, stitched to the stems by dew no eye could count. The Tully Monster slipped from its seam, feeling for the familiar seam line with the side of its body, the way a reader finds the crease of a well-used page. Water accepted it without remark. Acceptance is the oldest kindness here. A faint current braided sand into low chords, each chord a ridge that caught the story of whatever crossed it. The eyebar watched two ways, left eye on the chords, right eye on the pale window of shallows, where large shapes sometimes rehearsed certainty. The proboscis tested a hollow, brushed an air thread rising from a breathing tube and paused. The pause was a tool. A worm twitched, answer enough. The beaklet closed, the hollow erased its own evidence, and the Tully Monster moved on with the uncelebrated arithmetic of survival. Near the inlet, the world smelled of iron and leaf tea. A raft of stems had locked across the bottleneck, making a weir the current hummed through. In that tune, small lives stacked, amphipods sifting, juvenile crustaceans combing, thin ribbon animals taking turns at the table. The Tully Monster came at an angle that announced nothing. The eyebar read the raft's undersurface. The proboscis wrote its brief requests. This and this, not that, yes that. A ripple in a different register approached. An armor-headed fish, slow as a vow. The raft moved none. The Tully Monster drifted 3 fins' width deeper into shadow and became a comment tucked into the margin where even a diligent reader would not look. The fish approved the raft's scent and disapproved of the effort its plates would require to pry. It departed. The comment remained. Toward mid-morning, light turned the top 2 handspans of water to green glass. Schools rehearsed their commas, dragonflies stitched and unstitched lines in sky above. The Tully Monster tracked a path it had learned as a juvenile, under the elbow of a root, over a shelf where sand ran thinner, through a tunnel leaf litter had invented last storm. At the tunnel's far mouth, a pale body pulsed, soft as an unmade plan. The proboscis reached. The body pulsed wrong, jaw rings inside, teeth rimmed like a trap's lip. The beaklet met enamel. Reflex drew the Tully Monster into a tight coil. Flaps along the body beat in a syncopation that made torque. The jaw snapped on water and silt. Escape is as much an art as pursuit. The Tully Monster owned its few arts thoroughly. Heat steepled at noon. Logs whispered bubbles into the shallows. In the deeper tongue of the lagoon, where the current carried patience, a shark's signature arced once, twice, then was gone. Shadows carry echoes even underwater. The Tully Monster rested under the residual hush that follows a predator's decision to move elsewhere. It fed then, almost leisurely, a luxury purchased by vigilance. 3 morsels from the silt's small grammar, a larval curl from a leaf's underside, a soft scrap the storm had mislaid. The body acknowledged the sum. Hunger loosened its grip by a notch. Afternoon carried a rumor down the channels, pressure changing. Wind rehearsing over the coal forests, far thunder speaking in long vowels. The first rain came as questions, the second as answers, the third as a curriculum. The lagoon smoothed, lines blurred. The edge between air and water became an argument with no clear winner. Big bodies retreated to lanes where power can be spent profitably. The Tully Monster stepped closer to the bank's consonants, roots, mud, small ledges that catch and hold. It faced the incoming and let the incoming serve it. Flood carries both threat and rations. The proboscis accepted the ration. The tail edited the threat. Silt rode the reins back and laid itself down where lay was allowed. The Tully Monster felt the slow yet relentless weight of it, the way a sentence grows heavy with clauses. It shifted incrementally, the way a clause moves to preserve sense. In a pocket under a half-buried branch, water became thicker than water. Breathing was work. It worked. Above, leaves made a roof. The rain was pleased to break. Below, The pocket narrowed, and the world said, "Choose." The Tully Monster chose the smallest gradient where flow still offered persuasion, and crept along that permission until water thinned back into water. Behind, something softer did not choose quickly enough and became past tense. When the storm slackened, the lagoon unblurred into a room with rearranged furniture. New shelves, new hollows. The bank wore a fresh lip, soft now, hardening by hours. A lip that would break into nodules when sun and time had agreed on the formula. The Tully Monster explored as if the room were both house and stranger. It updated the map in its muscles. Safe slivers here and here. Avoid that new gutter where plates patrol. The seam of cold that laces from the inlet is now 2 body lengths left of where it was. Maps are only good until the world rewrites them. The Tully Monster lived in a library with no catalog. It shelved each change in the one place it could not lose: the body. For a week, what time feels like when counted in bellies and rests, the weather held its temper. Dragonflies patrolled and were not punished for it. Amphibians practiced songs until songs seemed like reasons. The Tully Monster grew by the unit you would miss unless you had measured yesterday's length with care. A crease along the flank stiffened slightly. The tail learned a new micro-angle that saved 1 pulse in 20. Economy is a kind of intelligence. Predators adjusted too. The shark learned the recut channel and rode it often. The armor-headed fish owned a loop and wore it thin. An eel-shaped thing with a sucker mouth, jawless, patient, appeared at dusk in the shallows and made its slow intentions clear by attaching to anything unhurried enough to let it. The Tully Monster did not let it. When it felt the pressure change that comes before a mouth like that mouths, it spun and left, a soft yes to the option of elsewhere. Hunger is not an enemy, it is a schedule. The Tully Monster kept the schedule without obedience and without defiance. At dawn, silt breathers along the new shelf. Midday, drift under the leaf raft for the fallouts and the slow. Evening, the seam where cooler water holds the bubble trails longer. Night, the root crease with the view of the open, eyes waking all 4 quarters in turn. It deviated when the map required it. It did not insist when insisting would be expensive. One morning, the lagoon wore a skin of pollen so thick it seemed a new substance had come to live between water and air. Each stroke broke it into bright confetti and then it healed, a surface that wanted its face untroubled. Under that temporary ceiling, the light went olive. The Tully Monster used the dim to make approaches it avoided on clear days. It visited the trilobite councils where shells clattered and glances were not given. Trilobites are confident in numbers and plates. The Tully Monster took nothing from them. They are work beyond its means, but plucked a soft-bodied thing, hiding among their legs. A thief among armored accountants. On the lagoon's far bend, a slow collapse had begun, mud slumping into the water in quiet sighs. Each sigh released iron smell and a thin veil of silt. The Tully Monster kept clear when the slope quivered, then skimmed the edge to harvest what the slump had unburied. A worm half evicted from its tunnel, a larval clutch shaken free. It fed quickly. Predators love fresh margins. The shark's line appeared at the mouth of the bend, tested the new geometry, and found it good. The Tully Monster had already abandoned the buffet for the safety of old grammar, roots, shadows, routes with memory in them. A colder spell came, not winter, but a counter-melody in the swamp's warm song. Breath smoked faintly where air met air. In water, the chill traveled as a persuasion to slow. Slowing is an invitation to anything that moves faster or hungers harder. The Tully Monster answered by making its movements smaller, closer, by reading ridges in sand and the faintest lifts of silt instead of chasing silhouettes that burned calories and paid badly. It found that beetles blundered more in cold, and that worms wrote their lines with a heavier hand. It adapted its grammar to the chill. At dusk, a procession drifted by, others of its own kind, a loose chain of Tully Monsters working the same seam, not together, not apart, A committee convened without agenda beyond the constant one. Their presence adjusted probabilities. A predator arriving would see many choices and would pause to decide. In pause, there is time, and time is a shelter. They did not speak. There is no speech here beyond movement and its echoes. But they negotiated space without damage, each proboscis making small and sentimental withdrawals from the account the seam offered. Night fell quietly. The lagoon's skin regained its mirror of dark. From the bank, voices worked at a choir, older than weather. In the upper water, a dragonfly failed to end the day where it had intended and made instead a sentence in some web's ledger. Underneath, the Tully Monster performed the rituals of safety. Align with slope. Watch the open and the overhang in alternating glances. Keep the tail free of snags. Do not dream with the body. It drowsed without closing the eye that looked into the open because the open never closes. In the weeks that followed, the swamp practiced variety. Some days were pure clarity, letters crisp on the page. Some were smears of silt, legible only to those who had learned to love smear. Once, a drought flirted with the lagoon and laid the water down an inch. Shallows warmed and thickened. The seam of cool retreated into a throat near the inlet. The Tully Monster followed the seam and learned a narrower home. Predators followed the fish that followed the seam. The room grew crowded. The Tully Monster moved less, fed at hours the crowd neglected, and let the press pass. Presses pass. They leave marks of memory and sometimes scars. Both are useful. Another rain returned the lagoon to generosity. In its wake, a burial event began. Not the quick suffocation of a slump, but the slow conspiracy nodules require. Fine silt settling evenly, chemistry shifting in mud to make iron matter, leaves and bodies becoming centers around which stone writes the word keep. A juvenile Tully Monster, soft as any hope, rode a wrong curl of current into a shallow pocket that would not unpocket. It ceased. Silt tucked it under. Iron grew its careful rind. The swamp recorded, as swamps do, the way a ledger records not meaning, but the faithfulness of numbers. The living Tully Monster passed nearby and learned nothing of this. It lived in present tense, which is how present tense is defined. Heat returned strong enough that by noon, the lagoon began to exhale as if it had lungs. Bubbles threaded past the Tully Monster's jaw and told it where rotting offered banquet. It followed the threads to a mat where leaf and time had married into a soft platform. The platform fed amphipods that fed the proboscis that fed the mouth. Cycle is a short word for a very long work. The Tully Monster did its portion. A shadow fell that was not a predator. Cloud only, but shadows practiced the same choreography. The body compressed, ready to leave without thought. It did not need to. The cloud drifted on. Not all rehearsals are performances. The Tully Monster resumed the sentence it had paused, and the day continued to be a day. By late season, the lagoon had become a book the Tully Monster could read in dark or bright. It knew where a burrower would likely set its vent, where a shrimp would pause to comb, where a beetle would row itself into a mistake. Knowing is not ownership. The map must be redrawn after every storm, every slump, every drought's small tyranny. But redrawing is part of the body now, as automatic as turning toward breath. One evening, copper again, the shark made a last patrol along the deep tongue. It did not climb the shelf. It had learned the shelf wastes energy. The Tully Monster, half under the raft of seeds, watched it pass without being included. A long-bodied amphibian broke the water beyond, gulped air like an astonished idea, and slid back. The swamp stitched all this into itself. Predator, watcher, boundary crosser, witness. The Tully Monster fed once more, not greedily. Greed is a risk, but enough to write the night with calm letters. It selected the root seam with a good view of open water, and the safe escape left, settled the tail where snag was least likely, and let the day loosen its grip. Eyes remained open because open is how softness survives. The lagoon cooled. Mists experimented with architecture. Somewhere upstream, the chemistry of stone continued its patient work on a body that would be a fossil. Downstream, breath went in, came out, and made no history except the only history that matters to a soft animal. A continued line. Morning will come, or it will not. The Tully Monster does not invest in prophecy. It invests in angles and seams, in pauses and pivots, in the proboscis's quiet grammar, and the tale's precise edits. It lives the edit. It becomes the sentence that the swamp keeps rewriting, and that keeps, against the larger odds of tooth and flood and time, resolving into meaning enough to go on. Dawn broke as a hesitation rather than an event. The lagoon shifted from charcoal to olive, from silence to the lightest percussion of insects waking above the water. The Tully Monster left its seam with the practiced caution of one who has outlived predators, larger and stronger. Every ripple was measured, every angle chosen. The eye-bar pivoted like a compass in motion. Leftward, a cluster of trilobites shuffled, plates rasping against one another like coins in a hidden purse. Rightward, stems bent into the water, their shadows weaving darker lines into an already unreadable page. Above, the sky was untrustworthy, bright enough for hunters to see, dim enough to conceal them. The Tully Monster trusted nothing except its body's memory of escape. It swam toward a new hollow, scoured by last night's small current. The floor here was littered with cast-off shells and broken stems, a midden for those who knew how to read it. The proboscis curled and tested each crevice. Once it closed on nothing, once on mud, and then on a living filament of worm. The worm's thrash ended quickly. The body swallowed. The story moved forward. Later in the deeper reach, shadows rehearsed menace again. A shark cut across the channel, wide head turning like punctuation that could change the meaning of a whole sentence. The Tully Monster stilled, bar eyes up, tail quiet as rock. The shark's path curved elsewhere. A decision spared one body and erased another. The way of these waters. Noon pressed the lagoon flat as hammered bronze. Heat rippled the surface, and below, oxygen thinned into fatigue. Amphibians near the bank gulped air with sudden jerks, their slick flanks shining like green metal. The Tully Monster remained in its chosen seam, flaps pulsing with economy, eyes scanning, proboscis reaching only when the certainty of prey outweighed the cost of effort. Soft bodies know the ledger of energy better than armored ones. By afternoon, a wind drew through the coal forest, bending the crowns of trees into murmurs that the water carried as tremors. Silt lifted and fell, painting the lagoon with dust the color of rust. In that blur, predators lost precision. The Tully Monster gained opportunity. It struck 3 times in minutes, each strike a meal. Small, but together enough to make hunger unclench its grip. Evening burned the horizon into copper fire again. Shadows lengthened in the water. Dragonflies stitched frantic seams above, their wings catching the last blaze of the sun. The Tully Monster glided beneath them, a phantom in green dimness. Its eyes rolled upward, catching the flashes of wings, but it did not rise. It was not built for air. Its world was here, the half-light of silt and root, the ceaseless theater of predator and prey. Night fell not as darkness, but as density. The lagoon thickened, sounds muffled, outlines blurred into haze. From the bank, frogs croaked, each note a stake in the territory of sound. From the depths, slow movers stirred, armored and hungry. The Tully Monster chose its seam carefully, settling where root met shadow, tail free, eyes open, proboscis curled inward like a question not yet asked. In the silence between movements, the lagoon seemed to pause with it. Survival was not conquest here, not dominion, not mastery. Survival was to remain unwritten by the jaws of others, to be a footnote instead of an erasure. And in that pause, the Tully Monster endured again, soft, strange, and stubborn as time itself. As seasons turned, the swamp shifted, Channels filled, lagoons drained, storms remade the shoreline. The creatures of Mazon Creek lived and vanished in cycles of hunger and chance. Some grew shells, some grew teeth, some rose onto land where new dangers awaited. The Tully Monster did not change. It endured. Its eyes swiveled, its proboscis curled, its ribbon body slipped between shadows. For millions of years, this soft, improbable hunter carved a place in the silted margins of rivers and estuaries. But time is relentless. What had once been a living swamp hardened into stone. Layers of shale pressed down, leaves turned to fossils, dragonflies to imprints, worms to shadows. The Tully Monster too disappeared, its ribbon body dissolved into memory. Only impressions and ironstone nodules remained, like messages sealed in envelopes of rock, waiting to be opened by hands not yet imagined. When those nodules cracked open in the coal fields of Illinois, 500 million years later, the five-eyed survivor returned. Not alive, but not forgotten. Scientists puzzled, laughed, argued. Was it a worm, a mollusk, a vertebrate? Even now, its place on the tree of life remains uncertain, a riddle pressed into stone. But the truth is simpler. It lived, it endured, and in its strangeness it was perfect for its time. The Tully Monster reminds us that survival is not about being the strongest or the largest or the most fearsome. Sometimes survival belongs to the strangest, to those who slip through cracks, thrive on the margins, and write their story in shapes no one expects. And that story is still being told. Every fossil we split, every question we ask, every strange imprint in rock is another reminder. Life's imagination is greater than ours. The past is stranger, wilder, and more alien than any myth we could invent. So when you see the Tully Monster's five-eyed gaze staring out from stone, remember, it is not a monster at all. It is proof that Earth has always been a place of endless experiments, and that even the strangest lives matter, if only for a moment in deep time. If the Tully Monster's mystery captured your imagination, there are countless more creatures waiting in stone, forgotten, bizarre, and powerful in their strangeness. Subscribe to Ancient Beast Behavior and join us as we uncover the lost experiments of evolution. The past is still alive, if you know where to look.